I thought paying off my parents' debt would finally make me part of the family again. Instead, one forgotten document proved I had never belonged in their future. My name is Avery Sullivan, and for most of my life, I believed love was something you earned through sacrifice. Whenever my family needed help, I was always the first person they called. When my younger brother, Lucas, abandoned his business after 6 months, I quietly paid the remaining loans so my parents wouldn't lose their retirement savings. When my father struggled after being laid off, I covered their mortgage for nearly a year without ever mentioning it to anyone. Every birthday, every holiday, every family emergency somehow found its way to my wallet, and I convinced myself that one day they would finally see everything I had done. My mother always smiled and called me her reliable daughter. At the time, I thought those words were a compliment. I didn't realize they were simply another way of saying I was the one they expected to carry everyone else's burden. 3 weeks before my parents celebrated their 45th wedding anniversary, they announced they were hosting the biggest family gathering our relatives had ever seen. They wanted an elegant ballroom, live music, professional photography, and a dinner worthy of the occasion. Without being asked, I volunteered to organize everything. I spent days meeting vendors, comparing prices, negotiating contracts, and quietly paying deposits from my own savings because I wanted the evening to be perfect. I imagined my parents walking into the ballroom with tears in their eyes, proud of the family they had built. That feeling alone seemed worth every dollar. Then 2 days before the celebration, a photographer accidentally emailed me the wrong attachment. I expected to see the final event schedule. Instead, I opened the official portrait plan for the evening. I scanned the page once, then again, convinced I had missed something. Every family member's name appeared beside their assigned photograph. My parents, Lucas, his wife Hannah, even distant cousins. But my name wasn't listed anywhere. At the very bottom of the document, a handwritten note stopped my heart. Keep Avery occupied with catering until family portraits are finished. I stared at the screen for nearly a full minute, hoping another attachment would appear explaining it was all a mistake. It never did. The portrait schedule was detailed down to the minute. Grandparents with Lucas. Parents with Lucas and Hannah. 3 generations. Legacy portrait. Every photograph had been carefully planned, and every one of them told the same story. A family that somehow existed without me. My first instinct was to call my mother, but something stopped me. If there was an explanation, she would have told me before I found the file myself. Instead, I quietly closed my laptop and drove to the ballroom for one final meeting with the event coordinator. The room was already taking shape. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished floors while workers arranged elegant centerpieces exactly where I had requested. Every detail I looked at had been chosen by me, paid for by me, and built around a celebration I suddenly wasn't sure I belonged to. As I reviewed the seating chart, the coordinator smiled. "Your mother called this morning," she said. "She wanted to confirm you'll be serving behind the buffet during the portrait session. She said you're more comfortable working than being in front of the camera." I forced a polite smile, but inside something quietly broke. I had never said those words. Someone else had said them for me. On my way out, I noticed another folder lying on the registration table. Across the front in bold gold letters were the words Sullivan Family Legacy Display. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened it. Inside were framed childhood photographs of nearly everyone in the family. Lucas had dozens. My parents had dozens more. I kept turning the pages until I realized there wasn't a single photograph of me after the age of 12. It was as if the last 18 years of my life had simply disappeared. I gently closed the folder and carried it back exactly where I had found it. That was the moment I stopped asking myself whether I had been forgotten. Someone had made sure I would be invisible, and I was about to find out why. That night I sat at my kitchen table long after midnight with the portrait schedule spread out beside my laptop. I kept reading the same handwritten note over and over again. Keep Avery occupied with catering until family portraits are finished. Not if she's busy. Not ask Avery. Keep Avery occupied. It wasn't an accident. It was a plan. A careful, deliberate plan. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. Don't forget to pick up the champagne order tomorrow. You're always so dependable. Dependable. There was that word again. For years I had worn it like a badge of honor. Now it sounded like a job description. I opened my banking app and started scrolling. Deposit after deposit. Payment after payment. Venue reservation. Floral arrangements. Music. Catering. Photography. Nearly every major expense for the anniversary had come directly from my account. I added the numbers together twice because surely I had to be wrong. I wasn't. I had spent almost $24,000 making this celebration happen. $24,000 for a family portrait I wasn't even allowed to stand in. The next morning I called my best friend, Olivia Carter. Olivia had known me since college, and possessed the rare ability to tell me the truth even when I didn't want to hear it. I emailed her the portrait schedule without saying a word. 10 minutes later she called. "Avery," she said quietly. "This isn't forgetting. This is excluding." I closed my eyes because hearing someone else say it somehow hurt more. Why would they do that? I whispered. Olivia was silent for a few seconds before answering. "Maybe because you've always stayed. People stop appreciating sacrifices they think they'll never lose." Those words followed me for the rest of the day. That evening I drove to my parents' house to deliver some final contracts. As I walked toward the kitchen, I heard my mother and Lucas talking in the dining room. I wasn't trying to listen. Then I heard my name. "As long as Avery keeps handling everything, we don't need to worry," my mother said casually. Lucas laughed. "She always does." I stood frozen in the hallway, holding folders filled with contracts I had paid for. And for the first time in my life, I wondered what would happen if I stopped being the person they could always count on. I drove home without going inside my parents' house. The folders remained on the passenger seat beside me untouched. For the first time in years, I didn't rush to solve another problem before anyone else noticed it. Instead, I spread every contract across my dining table. The venue agreement, the florist's invoice, the catering receipts, the photographer's booking confirmation. One detail caught my attention immediately. Every single contract listed the same client name, Avery Sullivan. My address, my phone number, my email. I frowned and opened another document. Then another. It was the same on all of them. My parents had never signed a single agreement. They had asked me to handle everything. And without realizing it, I had become the legal client for the entire anniversary. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. "Your mother wants to know if the violinist has been paid." No greeting. No asking how I was. Just another responsibility waiting for me. I calmly replied, "Yes," then set the phone face down. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty. The following morning, I scheduled coffee with Daniel Brooks, an attorney I had hired years earlier when I purchased my apartment. I wasn't looking for revenge. I simply wanted to understand what my rights actually were. Daniel carefully reviewed every contract before looking up at me. "Avery," he said, tapping the venue agreement. "Do you realize this event legally belongs to you?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" He slid the paperwork across the desk. "You're the contracting client. Every vendor answers to you. The event schedule, speeches, photography timeline, even the program. All of it requires your approval." I stared at him in disbelief. For weeks I had believed I was simply helping organize my parents' celebration. In reality, I had unknowingly become the person legally responsible for the entire event. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "If someone changes anything without your permission, they're violating the agreement." A slow realization settled over me. My family had spent years assuming I would quietly carry every burden. This time, without even knowing it, they had handed me something far more powerful than another responsibility. They had handed me complete control over the evening they believed belonged to them. Daniel closed the final folder and handed every document back to me in perfect order. "I'm not telling you to cancel the event," he said calmly. "I'm telling you to understand the position you're actually in." I left his office carrying the same paperwork I had walked in with, yet somehow it felt completely different. Until that morning, every contract had represented another sacrifice. Now they represented something else. Proof. Every payment, Every signature, every approval traced back to me. If anyone questioned who had built the anniversary, the answer was sitting inside the folder on my lap. Still, I wasn't interested in embarrassing my parents. I only wanted one thing they had never given me: the truth. That afternoon I drove to the ballroom for the final rehearsal. Staff members greeted me by name as soon as I walked through the entrance. "Good afternoon, Miss Sullivan," the venue manager smiled. "Everything is exactly the way you requested." I nodded politely while reviewing the ballroom one last time. Every chair sat perfectly aligned. The floral arrangements matched the sketches I had approved weeks earlier. The orchestra tested soft background music, while servers practiced the dinner service. Watching strangers carefully follow my instructions felt strangely ironic. Complete professionals respected my work more than my own family ever had. As I finished checking the stage lighting, I noticed the photographer speaking quietly with my mother near the fireplace. They didn't realize I had entered the room. My mother pointed toward the service doors before lowering her voice. "During the portrait session, keep Avery near the catering station. She'll understand that guests come first." The photographer hesitated. Shouldn't she be included in at least a few family pictures? My mother's smile disappeared for just a second. "It'll only complicate things," she replied. "Lucas is the one carrying this family now." Those words hit harder than I expected. Carrying this family? Lucas hadn't paid a single invoice. He hadn't attended one planning meeting. He didn't even know which venue had been booked until invitations were mailed. Yet somehow, he had become the hero of a story I had quietly written. I turned away before either of them saw me. There was nothing left to question anymore. I finally understood that this wasn't about one photograph. Someone had spent years rewriting my place in the family, and the anniversary was simply the final chapter of that lie. The day before the anniversary, I stopped trying to guess how much the truth would hurt. I already knew. What I didn't know was how long my family had been living inside a version of reality, where I simply didn't exist unless they needed something. I arrived at the ballroom just after sunrise for one final inspection. Workers were hanging crystal chandeliers while florists arranged the last white roses across the head table. The venue manager greeted me with a clipboard. "Everything's ready for your approval, Miss Sullivan." As we walked through the ballroom, he casually asked, "Would you like us to place your reserved seat beside your parents?" I frowned. "Reserved seat?" He looked confused. "The seating chart you approved originally had you at the family table." He handed me both versions. My heart sank. Someone had quietly replaced the original chart. My reserved seat had disappeared. In its place was another chair labeled "Special Guest." My name had been moved to the vendor's table near the service entrance. The manager immediately apologized. "I assumed you requested the change yesterday." I slowly shook my head. "No, I didn't." Without saying another word, he opened his email history. The revised seating chart had been sent from my mother's personal email only 48 hours earlier. My stomach tightened as I read the final sentence. "Please don't mention this change to Avery. We want tomorrow to be a surprise." I folded the papers and slipped them back into the folder. Every discovery made the picture clearer. First the portraits, then the legacy display. Now my own seat had quietly disappeared from my family's table. None of these decisions had been accidental. They had been carefully planned weeks in advance. As I prepared to leave, my phone rang. It was my father. His voice sounded unusually calm. "Your mother says everything's almost perfect," he said. "She's proud of how hard you've worked." I closed my eyes for a second before answering. "Is she?" There was a long pause. "Avery," he began, then stopped. Neither of us spoke again. After a few awkward seconds, he quietly ended the call. I stared at the blank screen in my hand. Somehow, his silence hurt even more than my mother's lies. Because deep down, I was beginning to wonder whether my father had known the truth all along. My father's unfinished sentence stayed with me for the rest of the day. He had never defended my mother. He had never denied what was happening either. That silence felt heavier than any argument. The following morning, the anniversary finally arrived. I reached the ballroom before anyone else, dressed in a simple navy blue suit instead of the formal gown my mother had chosen for me weeks earlier. The staff welcomed me warmly, assuming I was there to supervise the final preparations. In a way, I was. I walked slowly through the ballroom, checking every table one last time. The orchestra rehearsed softly in the background while servers polished crystal glasses beneath the warm lights. Everything looked exactly the way I had imagined months earlier. Ironically, it was the most beautiful event I had ever planned, and I no longer felt like I belonged inside it. Around noon, Daniel Brooks arrived with several revised copies of the event program I had requested the previous evening. "Everything is exactly as you approved," he said quietly, handing me the folder. I opened it carefully. Near the middle of the schedule, directly after my father's anniversary speech, a new line had been added in elegant gold lettering. A special word from the event host. Daniel looked at me for a moment before speaking. "Only the contracting client can approve changes to the official program. If anyone questions it, the venue is legally required to follow this version." I nodded and slipped the folder into my handbag. I still hadn't decided exactly what I would say. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to spend another evening pretending everything was fine. By 5 o'clock, guests began arriving. Relatives filled the ballroom with laughter while cameras flashed near the entrance. My mother looked radiant in an emerald green evening gown, greeting everyone as though she had personally created every detail around her. Lucas accepted compliments from distant relatives who praised him for giving your parents such an incredible celebration. Each time I heard those words, he smiled politely, never once correcting them. Across the room, my father stood quietly beside the stage, watching everything with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then the master of ceremonies walked onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and welcomed everyone to the Sullivan family anniversary celebration. The evening had officially begun, and in less than an hour, the carefully protected version of my family's history was about to face the one thing it had never survived before: the truth. By 6 o'clock, every seat in the ballroom was occupied. Soft piano music drifted through the room as waiters served the first course beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Relatives laughed, children played near the dance floor, and distant cousins admired the elegant decorations. Everywhere I looked, people were complimenting the evening. "This is the most beautiful anniversary I've ever attended. Richard and Patricia must have spent a fortune. Lucas really outdid himself." Each compliment landed exactly where my family wanted it to. My mother accepted every word with graceful smiles while Lucas thanked guests as though he had personally built the celebration from the ground up. I stood quietly near the back of the ballroom beside the venue manager, watching strangers admire a story that didn't belong to the people telling it. Surprisingly, I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply waiting. A few minutes later, dinner concluded and the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced warmly, "please direct your attention to the front as we celebrate 45 wonderful years of marriage." Applause filled the ballroom. My parents walked onto the stage hand in hand while cameras flashed from every direction. My father adjusted the microphone first. "Tonight isn't just about Patricia and me," he began. "It's about the family we've built together." More applause followed. Then he smiled toward Lucas. "And none of this would have been possible without our son. Lucas has carried this family through difficult years, and tonight's beautiful celebration is another example of his generosity." The room erupted into cheers. Guests stood to applaud while Lucas modestly shook his head and hugged both of my parents. My mother wiped away a tear as photographers captured the perfect family moment. I watched quietly from across the room. Daniel stood beside me without saying a word. The venue manager glanced toward the official program in his hands before looking back at me. "You're next," he whispered. On stage, my father stepped away from the microphone. The master of ceremonies smiled at the audience once again. "And now," he announced confidently, "according to the official program approved by the event host, we'd like to invite Ms. Avery Sullivan to the stage for a special word from the event host." Every conversation stopped instantly. My mother looked up in confusion. Lucas' smile disappeared. And for the first time that entire evening, every eye in the ballroom turned toward me. For a brief moment, nobody moved. My mother looked toward the master of ceremonies with obvious confusion, while Lucas stared at the official program in disbelief. The master of ceremonies smiled politely, unaware that anything was wrong. "Ms. Avery Sullivan," he repeated. "Would you please join us on stage?" The audience applauded warmly, expecting a heartfelt tribute from the daughter, who had quietly organized the evening. I took a slow breath and walked toward the stage. Every step echoed through the silent ballroom. I wasn't walking there to embarrass anyone. I wasn't looking for revenge. I simply refused to let another lie become part of my family's history. As I reached the stage, my father stepped aside without saying a word. His eyes met mine for only a second before dropping to the floor. I accepted the microphone and looked around the room. Nearly 100 guests waited quietly. Friends, neighbors, relatives. Many of them had watched me grow up. "First," I said calmly, "thank you all for being here tonight. My parents have spent 45 years building relationships with so many wonderful people, and they deserve to celebrate that achievement." Several guests nodded and smiled. "This evening has been an honor to organize," I continued. "Every flower, every table, every piece of music, every meal was chosen with one goal in mind. I wanted tonight to become a memory my parents would never forget." The room remained completely silent. Then I reached into the folder I had carried onto the stage. I also believe that every celebration deserves honesty. I placed several documents onto the podium. The venue contract, the catering agreement, the photographer's booking, the floral invoices. One by one, I lifted each document just high enough for the front tables to recognize the signatures. My name appears on every single contract because I organized and personally paid for this entire anniversary celebration. A wave of whispers swept across the ballroom. Lucas slowly turned toward my mother. My mother froze. My father closed his eyes. Then I spoke one final sentence. "I didn't come here tonight because I wanted credit. I came because I finally realized silence is what allowed this lie to survive for so many years." At that exact moment, someone in the front row quietly stood up and said, "She's telling the truth." The voice came from the front row. Everyone turned at once. It was Margaret Collins, my father's older sister. At 72 years old, Aunt Margaret had attended nearly every important family gathering since I was a child. She slowly stood, resting one hand on the back of her chair, before looking directly at my parents. "She's telling the truth," she repeated louder this time. "I've watched Avery carry this family for years." The ballroom fell completely silent. "Last Christmas she paid for your furnace when it failed," Margaret continued. 2 years ago she covered Richard's medical bills. And when Lucas closed his business, Avery was the one who paid the creditors." She turned toward the guests. "Most of you didn't know that because she never wanted recognition. She only wanted her family." The whispers around the ballroom became impossible to ignore. Lucas stared at me with a look I had never seen before. "Avery," he whispered, "I thought Mom and Dad were paying for tonight." I looked into his eyes and answered honestly, "I know you did." His shoulders slowly dropped as realization spread across his face. For the first time that evening, I saw genuine shock instead of pride. He turned toward our parents. "Is this true?" he asked quietly. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. My father remained motionless beside the stage, unable to deny what every document already proved. Finally, my mother forced a weak smile and stepped toward the microphone. "This is all just a misunderstanding," she said nervously. In return, he looked up at me, and every time, I stayed silent. The disappointment in his own voice hurt more than anything he could have said. My mother stepped forward, tears forming in her eyes. "I only wanted this family to look successful," she said desperately. Lucas was starting over. His in-laws expected so much from him. I didn't want them thinking our family depended on Avery for everything. I stared at her for several seconds. "So you erased me?" She couldn't answer. She simply lowered her head. I reached into my folder one final time and removed a single envelope. I wasn't planning to show anyone this. I handed it to the master of ceremonies. It arrived 2 days before the anniversary. He opened it carefully. Inside was the original family seating chart, the one with my name beside my parents. Attached to it was my mother's handwritten instruction requesting the change. The master of ceremonies silently passed it to the nearest table. Within seconds, the envelope was moving from guest to guest. No speeches. No arguments. Just undeniable proof. I quietly stepped away from the microphone. I didn't come here to humiliate my family, I said softly. I came because I refused to let my future be built on someone else's lie. I placed the microphone back onto its stand, picked up my handbag, and started walking toward the ballroom doors. Behind me, my father called my name. But this time I didn't stop. The ballroom doors closed softly behind me, but I barely made it halfway across the parking lot before I heard footsteps rushing behind me. Avery, please wait. It wasn't my mother. It wasn't my father. It was Lucas. I stopped but didn't turn around immediately. A few seconds later, he stood beside me, breathing heavily from running. The expensive suit he had worn with such confidence only an hour earlier now looked strangely out of place. I need you to believe me, he said quietly. I honestly thought Mom and Dad paid for everything. I finally looked at him. I know. He blinked in surprise. You believe me? Ido. His shoulders dropped with relief, but only for a moment. That somehow makes me feel even worse. He lowered his head. I spent years accepting praise that never belonged to me. Every compliment. Every thank you. Every time people called me the dependable son. I never questioned it. His voice cracked. I should have. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and handed me a folded envelope. I found this in Mom's desk last month, he admitted. She told me never to open it. I slowly unfolded the paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a spreadsheet. Year after year. Every loan. Every mortgage payment. Every hospital bill. Every family vacation deposit. Every emergency expense. Beside each payment, my name. At the very bottom, in my mother's handwriting, was a sentence that stole the air from my lungs. Don't tell Avery how much she's actually spent. She'll only insist on paying more. I stared at the page without speaking. Lucas quietly wiped his eyes. I didn't know, he whispered again. I swear to you, I didn't know. For the first time that night, I reached over and hugged my little brother. Not because everything had been forgiven, but because I finally understood something important. Lucas wasn't the person who had erased me. He had simply grown up believing the version of the family story someone else had written. As we stood there in silence, the ballroom doors opened again. This time, my father walked outside alone. He wasn't carrying his jacket. He wasn't carrying his phone. He was carrying a small wooden box. And the moment I recognized it, I knew my life was about to change forever. My father stopped a few feet in front of us, holding the small wooden box against his chest as though it weighed far more than it actually did. I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to my grandfather. As children, Lucas and I had been told never to open it because it contained important family papers. I hadn't seen it in almost 20 years. My father looked at me with tired eyes before carefully placing the box on the hood of my car. I should have given this to you a long time ago, he said quietly. With trembling hands he lifted the lid. Inside were old photographs, yellowed letters, property deeds, and a faded leather journal. Resting on top was a sealed envelope with my name written across it in my grandfather's handwriting. To Avery. When she's finally ready to know the truth. I stared at it in complete disbelief. My father left that for you before he passed away, my father admitted. He told me to give it to you when you were old enough to understand what this family had become. Why didn't you? I asked softly. He closed his eyes. Because I was ashamed. The words hung in the cold night air. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. If you're reading this, it means you've spent your life carrying people who should have been walking beside you. I watched it beginning before I died. Your heart is generous, Avery, but never confuse generosity with obligation. A family that only values what you provide will eventually forget who you are. Promise me one thing. When that day comes, choose yourself without guilt. I couldn't stop the tears. It felt as though someone had understood my entire life years before it had even happened. My father quietly wiped his own eyes. He saw it, he whispered. He warned me. I thought I could fix it later. Lucas looked at our father in disbelief. You knew Grandpa felt this way? My father nodded slowly. I knew. And I ignored him. He reached into the wooden box again and removed one final document. It was the deed to a small lake cottage my grandfather had owned for decades. I was supposed to transfer this to you after he passed away, my father admitted. But your mother convinced me to keep it, because she wanted to sell it for the anniversary and club membership. Lucas looked at him in shock. The anniversary wasn't paid for with Avery's money alone. My father lowered his head. It was paid for with her future. The parking lot fell silent, because in that single moment, I realized my family's betrayal had begun years before I ever noticed it. And this wooden box contained every answer I had never known. I didn't open the cottage deed right away. Instead, I looked across the quiet parking lot toward the ballroom where music had started playing again. Life inside was trying to continue as though nothing had happened. But nothing about our family would ever be the same. My father slowly sat on the curb, looking older than I had ever seen him. Your grandfather bought that cottage for you, he said softly. He used to tell everyone it was where his oldest granddaughter would one day build a peaceful life. He smiled sadly. He knew you loved the lake more than anyone. I held the deed carefully, unable to speak. Every dream I thought had disappeared years ago had quietly been waiting for me all along. Just then the ballroom doors opened once more. My mother stepped outside. Her makeup was streaked from crying, and for the first time in my life, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She walked toward us slowly before stopping a few feet away. Nobody said a word. Finally, she looked directly at me. I spent so many years worrying about how this family looked to other people, she whispered. I stopped seeing the people standing right in front of me. Tears rolled down her face. Every time you helped us, I told myself we'd make it up to you later. Then later became next month, next year. And eventually I convinced myself you didn't need anything because you never complained. She took a shaky breath. I wasn't protecting this family, Avery. I was protecting my pride. For the first time that evening, there were no excuses. No blame. No attempt to rewrite history. Just the truth. She reached into her handbag and placed a thick envelope beside the wooden box. I called Daniel while you were outside, she said quietly. Everything we own has been rewritten. The lake cottage is yours. The house will be divided equally. Every dollar you loaned us will be repaid from the first assets we sell. She looked down at the ground before adding, it still won't repay what we took from you. I looked at the documents but didn't touch them. This isn't about money anymore, I said calmly. It's about trust. My mother nodded, accepting every word. I know. I stepped toward my car and picked up the wooden box. My future doesn't begin because you finally admitted the truth, I said softly. It begins because I finally stopped waiting for your permission to matter. No one answered. Because every person standing there understood. The hardest part wasn't earning forgiveness anymore. It was proving they deserved a place in the future I was finally building without them. The following Monday morning, I met Daniel at his office. The documents my mother had signed over the weekend were already waiting on the conference table. The lake cottage was officially mine. The repayment agreement had been notarized. Every financial record my parents had hidden for years was finally transparent. Daniel slid the final page toward me with a small smile. Everything is legally complete, he said. No one can change it now. I signed my name, closed the folder, and realized something unexpected. I didn't feel victorious. I felt peaceful. For years, I had believed justice would feel like watching someone else lose. Instead, it felt like finally getting my own life back. Over the next few months, things changed in ways I never expected. My parents sold the country club membership they had been so desperate to protect, and used the money to begin repaying every debt they owed me. My father started calling every Sunday, not because he needed something fixed, but simply to ask how I was doing. Sometimes we talked for 20 minutes. Sometimes only 5. The conversations were awkward at first, but they were honest. Lucas refused every compliment people tried to give him for the anniversary. Whenever someone mentioned that beautiful evening, He corrected them immediately. That was Avery, he would say. She made all of it possible. Hannah stood beside him every single time. No hesitation. No embarrassment. Just the truth. 6 months later, I invited everyone to the lake cottage for dinner. Not because everything had been forgotten, but because healing deserved a chance. There were no photographers, no speeches, no expensive decorations. Just homemade food, quiet conversation, and a sunset my grandfather would have loved. Before we ate, my father stood up holding a glass of lemonade. He looked at me and smiled. For years, he said, I thought the strongest person in this family was the one who carried everyone else. He paused. I was wrong. The strongest person was the one brave enough to stop. No one applauded. No one needed to. The silence carried more meaning than words ever could. As the sun disappeared behind the lake, I looked around the table and realized something I had spent half my life searching for. Respect earned through truth feels infinitely lighter than love earned through sacrifice. And for the very first time, I wasn't sitting at the table because of what I had given. I was sitting there because I finally knew my own worth. Sometimes the deepest betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people we spend our lives trying to protect. But this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about discovering that your worth should never depend on how much you're willing to sacrifice for others. Real love doesn't erase your place in the family, it honors it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful emotional stories every week. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were Avery? Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, take care of yourself, and never let anyone make you believe your kindness is your only value.